I'm Bob Coleman, and we're talking Main Street and the small business lenders who help it grow. Thank you to this week's sponsor, the 4th Annual National Association of Commercial Loan Broker event in Orlando in October. Here's today's top story. At a hearing at the Small Business Committee at the House, Patrick Hedren, he's with the National Association of Manufacturers, discussed small business regulation. It's interesting the stats that he says in there. Almost 95% of members are optimistic about their company's outlook, but 1 in 3 spend 7 hours a week on paperwork, and 1 in 4 spend 10 hours a week. Listen to his testimony before Congress.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to testify in front of you today about the impact of regulatory reform on small manufacturers in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the kind introduction earlier. I would like to focus my remarks on 3 key messages. First, when it comes to small business impacts, it's not just the heat, it's the humidity. Small manufacturers worry about the accumulation over time of overlapping and even conflicting rules, not just the big-ticket items. Second, reducing burdens on small manufacturers is not about the number of rules that come off the books, but it's about the way the executive branch approaches regulation. And third, right now is an ideal time for Congress and the executive branch to reflect on what works and to reform the things that do not work. Today's hearing comes at a very interesting time for regulatory policy in general. Last year saw some of the biggest shifts in regulatory policy that I'm aware of. Congress passed, Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, and the President signed 15 Congressional Review Act resolutions. That is about 15 times as many as ever before. The President issued Executive Order 13771, which calls on agencies to remove 2 regulations for each new one that they issue and to adhere to a net zero budget. And while agencies begin to reevaluate their existing rules with an eye toward reform, new major rulemaking has slowed dramatically. The truth as we see it is that reforming ineffective and costly regulations is painstaking work. And we see care and deliberation as a good thing. But our members are optimistic because of relatively calmer waters in this space, and they're investing as a result. In our most recent quarterly outlook survey at the end of 2017, 94.6% of NAM's members said that they were positive about their own company's outlook. That's an all-time high for that survey. That number naturally made headlines. For regulatory geeks like myself, the 4th quarter survey also highlighted some interesting points. Over a third of respondents said that they spend at least 7 hours per week on regulatory paperwork, and almost a quarter spend over 10 hours. 4 in 10 felt like they had enough guidance on how to comply with the regulations to which they're subject. Over half need to retain a law firm to help them keep up with paperwork. And at the same time, manufacturers are not anti-regulation. Over 3/4 told us that smart regulations are essential to ensure a level playing field. Our members want to see regulations that make sense for how small and medium-sized manufacturers work in the real world. And we know that this is a bipartisan goal. Regulatory policy is always contentious, however, because the benefits of regulation are usually diffuse while the burdens are usually concentrated. Some sectors, like our own, bear a major share of overall regulatory costs in the economy, and our smaller members experience regulation on almost a personal level, and certainly to a greater degree. Despite bipartisan agreement that we need to do a better job in this space, we worry that both sides are talking past each other. Rulemaking by its nature should be about finding the right balance between the goals to be achieved and the price to be paid. So reforming the regulatory system is really about putting in place basic procedures to ensure that agencies do their best to achieve that balance. They should understand the parties they're regulating, they should evaluate meaningful alternatives, and they should try to maximize the net benefits of their rules.
At last week's office hours, Lance Sexton and I discussed SBA 7A and 504 file review, also site visits. I apologize for the quality of Lance's audio. We had to tie it in over the phone, but that does not distract from the quality of his information. How often do you complete the file review on your SBA portfolio?
Well, this is an interesting question, Bob, because the SBA SOP 5057-2 only indicates one specific time where a file review has, or one time, well, they don't actually indicate a time when a file review has to take place. I was getting off on site inspections. There's only one time in the 5057-2 that actually says you have to do a site inspection, and that's when a loan goes into default. File reviews, here's my take on that. I like to see a file review done once the loan is closed.
Mm-hmm.
And if a loan goes into past due status, I think it's imperative to do file review at that time. And then another absolutely necessary time for file review is right prior to submitting for guarantee purchase. And I know it sounds like I'm saying the same thing once it goes past due and right prior to guarantee purchase, but there can be quite a gap in time, Bob, between that first 30-day past due and going into guarantee purchase. So at close, and you can review the files as often as possible, but I think a best practice at a minimum, once you close the loan, review the file, fix any exceptions that occur. If the loan ever becomes past due, review the file. And if you ever are getting ready to submit for guarantee purchase, review the file.
Lance, do you advocate for a best practice that we review these files annually? Is that overkill, or we do a sample review?
Well, I think it's overkill, and I do think there are a lot of institutions where their prudent lending practice is an annual site visit.
Right.
It's not required. And I know there are a lot of people that would dispute that, but show me in the SOP where it says you do an annual site visit. But it can be a prudent lending practice. I think a lot of it depends on the complexity of the loan. If you've got a $25,000 revolving line of credit, annual site visits and annual file reviews, in my opinion, is overkill.
But I agree with you. I would say if your practice is to do an annual site visit on your conventional loans, then you must do them with your SBA loans. And I agree with you. Pick a dollar amount above X amount of dollars. Be dollar sensitive.
Yeah, I think the type of loan and the size of the loan should dictate the frequency of file review and site visit.
Next, Lance and I had a discussion about liquidation deadlines. The amount of time a lender has to liquidate a 7A loan before they get a bill from SBA. Specifically, we talked about extensions, and we also gave a little historical background as to why this is such an important topic. Tim asked the question, Lance, in terms of liquidations, we understand the deadlines of we need to liquidate these within 2 years from default. But here we have a situation, it's beyond our control. We have a bankruptcy. The borrower's not talking to us. We're going well into the third year. What do we do, Lance?
Well, you can get an extension to the wrap-up. I worked on several of those in late 2017, and I'm starting to get, Bob, finally a response. You know, it's like you have an absolute deadline for your wrap-up extension request, but we'll send you your approval or decline whenever we get around to it. You know, in the SOP 5057-2 is pretty clear about what you need to have in terms of asking for an extension of the wrap-up period. I think it's very important that those loans that are going to take more than 2 years, that you make that request, because if you do have an SBA on-site or off-site review, that is going to be a question that's asked to your institution. They're going to give you the list and say these loans have been in wrap-up or been in liquidation for more than 2 years. What's the status? If you can go back to the reviewers and say, we've submitted a request for extension of the wrap-up period, they're satisfied. And
Lance, have you heard any stories of SBA rejecting those requests for extensions? I've not heard any.
I have not heard, but but I did submit for a extension request, Bob, and I got the approval back. And the approval, they didn't agree with my time frame. So when I got the approval back, I had 9 days to finish. So I mean, and I certainly got on the phone and got that corrected, because I said, look, guys, that makes no sense. It took you almost 200 days to give me the approval, and you give me 9 days. So I have not heard of decline, but I'm sure there will be. If your wrap-up extension request is not reasonable, I can see the SBA declining.
I think the takeaway on this is, let's go ahead and file for those extensions. Let's send the letters in. Where SBA will be prickly is when we don't even request the extension. If you're requesting the extension, you're showing you're being prudent lender, you're on top of this, you're going to be okay. As to repeat myself, I haven't heard of any rejections of the dates. As Lance says, they may give you a date, but again, they're reasonable. They want you to communicate with them. It's when you're not talking to them that you're going to have to.
Well, and I think the huge problem that you would have is if your institution completely ignores the list of loans that may have been in liquidation for that long, and either doesn't have it wrapped up or a request for extension in place. I think that's where you get in trouble.
Holly has a question.
Here,
go ahead, Lance. Finish up.
Bob, one quick comment. This makes me think about Congress has been more involved in SBA lending in the last 2 years than I have ever seen in my lifetime. And these wrap-up report deadlines are a result of Congress looking at SBA and saying, it's basically SBA cleaning up the book. There was this huge flood of loans that the guarantee had been paid, they had not been wrapped up. And my understanding is, you know, Congress was pushing that button saying, hey, you need to clean this up.
Since you brought that up, again, let me, just some historical knowledge. For years, there's always been a fight for SBA funding from the Republican side of the aisle. And there would always be fights. You would hear that they would do with the agency, and this was a consistent theme. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the Republicans on the Senate and the House, it's bipartisan, bicameral, have said, okay, we understand SBA lending is for Main Street, access to credit, and it pays for itself. And so they're on board with that. But with that, they want certain things done. They want the books cleaned up. They want these loans liquidated. And they want to make sure we're doing good loans. And that's why they're putting more money into oversight. I have no issue with that. And I'm glad to see that they're taking an interest in that as opposed to saying, do away with it. It's a bad program. Finally, last week was SBDC Day. So I'm finishing this podcast with a 40-second clip from SBA Administrator Linda McMahon.
I'm Linda McMahon, the Administrator for the U.S. Small Business Administration. And today is SBDC Day, the day we celebrate our small business development centers all across the country. These centers provide counsel and training for our entrepreneurs who are starting or growing their businesses right in their own communities. So I want to thank our almost 1,000 SBDCs all across the country for their continuing help with our small businesses. And I want to encourage our entrepreneurs to go to sba.gov to find the SBDC closest to you and your community.
Thank you for joining us for today's update and for supporting America's Main Street, one entrepreneur at a time.